let's turn really quick to the Alan Savory argument. We had the students read your Slate piece, and there you do raise these questions about efforts to mimic nature and whether that's really possible. You also raise some questions about desert algae crust and so forth in there. In the book, I don't know if it's in the article, I think it's actually in the book, where you point out that a lot of the data he uses comes from a period in Zimbabwe when rainfall was actually 24% higher than it normally is, and so may have really skewed some of the results that he's citing. All the same, this TED Talk that we had the students watch went viral and took on a huge kind of prominence and made people feel like it was now environmentally okay to eat certain kinds of pasture-raised beef again, and that actually that would be contributing to environmental goodness rather than detracting from it. So I'm just curious whether you have gotten response to this sort of attack on Savory that you found at all plausible.
Well, I mean, the first point here is it's much easier to sell a 22-minute TED Talk that says you can eat beef and save the planet than it is to wade through a lot of environmental science exploring whether or not this idea holds any water. And the fact is, there is just far too much documented evidence of Savory's methods failing repeatedly, including during that period when rainfall was 24% higher. The claims that he makes about improving biodiversity, improving grasslands, are driven home in his TED Talk with pictures. And I think we all know how easily that can be manipulated to achieve a desired result. I'm not a scientist, but for that Slate article, talked to dozens of scientists and just asked them to walk me through why Savory was wrong. And 2 points came up. One, you indicated both of them. One is that his previous results just simply don't in any way justify the projections that he's making. He says we should quadruple the number of cattle on the planet in order to reverse global warming. And that's an outlandish claim in a lot of ways, and you would think there would
dangerous claim.
Well, you would think there would at least have to be some evidence to support it, even on a micro scale. And there isn't. It's just not there. You can't point to it. Savory can point to some pictures and and make inferences from that. And he has actually gone on record as saying the scientific method teaches us nothing. I mean, he has said that on a couple of occasions. George Monbiot at The Guardian interviewed him extensively, asking him to provide this evidence to support his claim, and he couldn't, and he just dodged the question over and over again. So I mean, so that's just something to consider in terms of plausibility. But the other point is that I think Savory's understanding of biodiversity, and this harkens back to something we were talking about earlier, is really quite limited. It comes down to what you can see. If you can see waving, healthy fields of grass, you think, well, that's biodiversity. Well, that's certainly something that I would be prone to. And then I talked to all these desert ecologists who were showing me these pictures of what looked to be just completely desiccated, god-awful landscapes, and they said, actually, the biodiversity here is invisible, but it's tremendous. And they study all kinds of bacterial biodiversity, and desert ecosystems have a kind of biodiversity that's not as visible. And so this leads me back to that point that I think the popular understanding of biodiversity is something that I think Savory appeals to very seductively, but when you actually take the analysis down to a level of, what is biodiversity, the idea that we could replicate an ancient relationship between landscape and animals on that landscape to foster a kind of pre-industrial biodiversity strikes me as one of the wildest environmental ideas I've ever heard. And so,
has anyone come to Savory's defense against some of your critiques that you've noticed and found plausible?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some defenses of Savory's critique, but I want to explain. I think a few came out of Texas A&M recently. I don't have their names at the tip of my tongue. But the nature of the defense is very common, and that is to find, again, a kind of microcosm in a microclimate of the general idea of cattle reviving grasslands working, which it certainly does in certain controlled contexts,
Yeah.
using that to justify Savory's idea, forgetting that Savory's not talking about a controlled microclimate. He's talking about the world. He's talking about a global landscape, and so it's just hard for me not to believe that the enthusiasm for Savory's idea comes from, I think, an increasing desire a lot of consumers have to kind of morally or ethically justify eating, beef on
Sure.
environmentally sound grounds. And
What would
so,
you say?
I would love to
Yeah.
see an idea like that validated, but
Yeah.
I guess I just have I need to see the numbers first and really have an honest understanding that this is a viable method.
What would you say in response to someone who is maybe a little less radical and didn't want to suggest that beef can save the planet or reduce greenhouse gases or something like that, but that emphasized that there's a lot of arid land, there's a lot of non-arable land that we couldn't put vegetables on and we couldn't live on. I mean, I think actually of some of the hills around here, they're terraced and they're kind of rocky, and it wouldn't be that easy to plant anything on them really or live on them. But you can put cattle on things like that, and they can eat the grass and they can fertilize the space and maybe sequester some carbon there. Are you open to that kind of a thought?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm open to that idea.
Yeah.
The problem comes in when you intervene in that system about 20% of the way through the animal's life to remove the animal from the system to commodify that animal.
Ah.
So what that requires is replacing the animal. And if you look at the costs involved in breeding and raising these animals and releasing them on the landscape, the kind of cyclical scenario that you described is undermined. So the notion of turning animals onto land that you can do nothing else with isn't necessarily a problem. The problem for me is the human intervention
Right.
into that system to commodify the animal. I mean, what's often forgotten when we talk about bringing back or reviving supposedly damaged landscapes with these animals is that the kind of ancient system that Savory evokes in his model had those land animals living out their lives. I mean, there was predation, but I think the statistics are that a lot of animals led out the entirety of their lives and were not victims of predation, and then they died and their bodies rotted back into the soil and returned all of their nutrients back into the soil, not just their manure while they were alive.
Yeah.
And so that has to be factored into this cycle as well. And of course, we're not talking about that kind of agricultural reform.